In this lesson, we'll be taking a look at the different LFO modulators and specifically trying to determine what the differences are. That way, depending on your situation, will you need to go to the Bead Lfo? Will the Classic Lfo and the regular Lfo not get the job done for you? And the answer is there are a few situations where, yes, you do want to pick one of these specifically. But for the most part, these Lfos do the same thing. And so we should have no problem understanding how they work and what their functions are. So we'll begin with the Classic Lfo. As a reminder, LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. And what that really means is that we can then here set the rate of this LFO. Low frequency in this case means below the range of human hearing, below 20 hertz. You see that the value I'm at is now 1.18 hertz. We can run this into an audio range, but when we do that, it stops becoming more of an LFO and becomes more of just a frequency modulator. And we'll be able to hear that in just a second, how when we start going really fast, it no longer sounds like an LFO. And the main point of the LFO is that it generates waveforms just like the waveforms you generate inside of a synthesizer, but because it's so slow, it works as a great control signal where it actually will trace along the wave shape depending on, what you set it to. So where is this routed? In this case, we're routed to the filter frequency, and we can see how it's going along smoothly like so. If we were to go to the square wave, it's going to jump back and forth based on that timing. Every 0.38 hertz, it jumps back and forth. All right. So with the Classic Lfo, what makes this one unique, first of all, has to do with playing back versus the transport. So you see we're at 100 BPM here. If I go in, I choose one of these syncing to beats, you're going to hear that when it starts, it actually is following along based on the timeline. So we can listen. So every quarter note, it's going through that cycle. One full cycle here with the sine wave. And if I start anywhere, it actually will adjust accordingly. So if I start here at 3.4, when we get back to 4.1, it's going to be restarting. So you'll see that syncs right back in. So that's really important. You know that this starting point is based on where you play back on the transport. That's not true, however, when you have this on an instrument. Okay, so here we have the polysynth, and we can actually go in here and speed this one up a little bit, put it to a half note. But you can see as I'm tapping every time, it's going around, and when I'm playing back, right, it's not reacting to the note that I'm hitting in any way, but it will re-trigger, as you just saw there, every time. So it's actually still following that same logic. If you want it to restart every time you press a note, you're going to go and hit the note trigger button. So now it always goes back to that starting point. And so we'll get a little bit more into that in just a little while, but let's go back over now to the little pad sound that we have going on, and we'll talk about the other controls. Amount is going to set the depth for you. So if we want to limit the range, we can do it in two ways. One would be to go back in here and just like bring that down, or go in here and bring it down, or we can actually change the amount. So I can bring this right down so there's a much shorter range, and you can see that the graphic updates accordingly. Phase is probably the most interesting of all of these. Phase determines where it's going to start. So let's assume again that we're starting like right on the 1, or in this case, we're starting right at 5.1. With this starting at 100%, each time it goes, it starts from the dead center. Maybe we'll go down and put this to a bar so it's easier to see. You can see I was always starting from the center and then going in either direction. If I bring the phase up to 25%, since we are in bipolar mode, this would mean that it's going to start at the very top and then start going down. So you can see accordingly. If I go to 50, it's going to start at the center again, only now instead of going up, it's going to go down. And of course, everything is going to exist in between as well. So we get to about 50. You can see that's 75%. What do you think is going to happen? Well, it's going to start at the lowest point and then work its way up. And then at 100%, we're right back to where we were at 0. So the only thing that would be different is if we were to go to like 80 or something, we'd be starting a little bit below and then coming up. So you can hit all those different phase points there. If we turn bipolar off, it's just going to go forward in time. And obviously then that impacts the phase as well, depending on where things are going to exist in time. And I'll let you experiment with that. It's pretty easy to understand. We have the ability to adjust the curve on this. And this is probably the coolest part about the Classic Lfo. We can go in here and shape this a little bit more aggressively, and you'll immediately start to hear some potential for this. With the random modes, it works a little bit differently because of how the shape is working. Like it will preface, and preface isn't necessarily the right word. You just kind of have to experiment with this. But you'll see that when I go here and I bring the curve up to 100%, we seem to spend a lot more time up on this angle of it just because that's the wave shape that's kind of being pushed to. And then go the other extreme. It's down below now much more. It'll still make an aggressive move. It's still random, but it's a way of kind of offsetting it, which I think is really nice. And then when you have like the sawtooth, you can actually kind of shape these in unique ways too. So I can already tell you guys that I'm going to be using this parameter all the time with the Classic Lfo. Maybe the last thing worth showing you is that here we do have the option to go in per voice. And by going in per voice, what we're really doing is we're doing a polyphonic Lfo, meaning that now we should kind of ignore what's going on in the display once we start to press additional notes, because they will all now operate at different places depending on when we press them. So you can hear that if I turn per voice off, they're all going to be following the same curve. Very different. So that's a really cool thing that you're definitely going to want to experiment with. And when you do go in per voice, again, you kind of have to ignore what's happening in the display on the knob and focus more on the jumping that you're seeing in here from the display. One other thing that makes the Classic Lfo unique is that if you were to jump between different times, set up a macro or use some other kind of modulator to modulate the time parameter, it is going to jump to these times. It is not going to gradually go from a quarter note to a half note to a whole note. Nope, it's going to go quarter note, half note, whole note. The only time when that's different is if you were to go in and use the time setting, and that will go on a smoother scale. Okay, so that is something to be made well aware of when we get to the other types of LFOs. The other thing I promised I would show you and let you listen to is what happens when you take the speed and you go up into an audible rate. So we'll listen to it here. It stops becoming an LFO and just more of like a special effect. So you can hear that. You get all sorts of variation. This might be something fun to modulate. Bring the amount down. So just something fun that you could experiment with on your own. Not something you're going to do all the time. But that pretty much does it for the Classic Lfo. The Bead Lfo is very similar to what we just looked at with the Classic Lfo. The difference is sort of how you set the timing and the fact that the timing can move freely. So it kind of is going to be more of a gradual shift as compared to that abruptness and shift. So by default, when you're right in the middle, you're actually going to be playing like a quarter note here. And let's actually go and do this maybe with the pad so we can hear it. And you have the ability to either speed it up or slow it down. And so the idea would be to probably try to lock it into like perfect numbers. Like 1, I think, would then be like 8th notes. 2 would maybe be 16th notes. 3 would maybe be 32nd notes. Don't quote me on that. I'm not really 100% sure. But needless to say, it is going to try to keep it onto the beat. So it tries to keep it in sort of a logical place. And if you do have grooves set up, it will apply groove to how it's bouncing back and forth. And that's a really cool thing that we didn't see in the Classic Lfo. You can obviously turn that off if you want it to be straight. Don't forget that you can get to your groove settings down here from the play. So in this case, I don't even have groove enabled, but if you do, definitely experiment with that. So you can hear the way it kind of is going to these different points and keeping it though in time. Or we could slow it down. But notice that in this case, the phase actually operates a little bit differently. So if we bring this way down, you'll notice that the starting point here on the 1 is actually at the top. And that wasn't the case before. It started it right in the middle. And in this case, the phase option is going to be down here. And you can now offset this into both a negative and a positive direction. And it's going by a value. So now we're starting way on the other side and coming up. If we go to -2, we're now starting in the middle and going down. So this is kind of the important part. This is what makes this different. If we go back to 0, we are now starting at the top and coming down. But now as we go into a positive direction, if we go up to the value of 2, we now are starting in the middle and going up. So this is what we were used to before in the Classic Lfo. And then at 4, we're actually starting all the way down and coming up and going back down this way. So something to definitely experiment with and be aware of. This is one of the big differences. The amount slider is here, and then you just change the shape accordingly. Notice that with the Bead Lfo, we do not have any way of changing, or I should say, syncing this to any kind of like note re-trigger. So in this case, you can hear how they then all sync in to time. So that is something to be made well aware of, a big part of this. So let's actually slow this down just so we can really hear it so we all know what's going on with that. Slow it way down. We'll change the shape a little bit just to make it fun. Actually, let's not go random. It's going to be confusing. We'll do it this way. So they're all locking in, regardless of when I hit the key. So this one is not going to operate polyphonically. But a great part of this is that it's easy to modulate these different parameters, and you can modulate them on a smooth sort of a curve, gradually go between the two as compared to having to jump from point to point to point. All right, so that is the Bead Lfo. The last LFO, simply just called Lfo, is probably the most powerful of the three that we've looked at, so don't let the shortness of name confuse you. This one really is kind of a beast. And so with this Lfo here, let's start immediately by looking at these different kind of trigger modes. And so we have here the phase again is the second option, but the first option is the one that's really important. When we have sync means that it is going to pay attention to the timeline and operate as the other two LFOs did before. So you can see that I've brought it in here. I've set it to a bar. It's always starting at that point. Again, not starting in the middle, starting at the top. But now with this one, we do set phase from 0 to 360. So now we have to start thinking a little bit differently. You know, if I go to 180 now, we're going to be starting at the bottom, I believe. If we're going to go totally out. Let's see. Yeah, so now we start at the bottom and come up to the top. And if we go all the way to 360, it should be exactly the same thing as starting at 0. Yep. So you have to kind of experiment with that one on your own. One thing that would be nice is if the wave shape actually moved when you changed the phase, so you had an idea at where it was starting and how it's going through the progression here. We also have the option to put this in free mode, in which case it's not going to matter when I click play. It's just going to go through like that. We also then have the ability to trigger this by note, and that is something I will talk about in a little while, probably at the end of this video. Then we have random. So random is going to mean we're not 100% sure where it's going to start. And in this example, it's more or less moving free. That's going to make a much bigger difference when you actually are playing in notes as well. So we will look at that when we are triggering in notes. All right, cool. So let's go through some of these other options here. We have the option to change bipolar like always. This is going to set the depth. We have the ability to change shape. And then probably the timing is the thing that may be of most interest to you. So you can kind of freely move this up and down, but it is important to be aware of like these different times. So if we're at, let's say, a half note here, and you can put this into hertz and be aware that you can go way up, kind of like you could do before. But if we're here at a half note and we're right in the middle, it's basically saying 1 times a half note is a half note. If I go to 2, we could expect this to then go at a quarter note. So I'll go ahead and just play this so we can hear it. So you can hear that like so, or if we go to 3, 4, and so forth, that will still kind of sync it into times, but now it really does all depend on where you start this thing. And then obviously you can go down and go into the opposite way as well. So if you're starting at 1, you can go down to 0.5 or go down to like 0.25 and so forth to really kind of slow this down. You can make it go really, really slow if you elect to do that. Okay, so that is how the LFO is going to work on more of like an audio source. We'll look at how it works on a hybrid source in just a second. But if we go in here and we use this LFO onto an actual note input here, it does operate a little bit differently and we have more options. So right now, I do have the poly turned on. And when I do that, this will work polyphonically. And so all of these notes are now going at different points as compared to if I had that turned off. And as of right now, I haven't routed this anywhere. So let's go ahead and route that to the filter frequency just so we can actually hear what it is I'm talking about. So we have poly turned off right now. And every time I hit a note, triggers, but it locks them all in compared to going in polyphonic mode. And that's something really cool and worth experimenting with in your own time. So again, we could have this either syncing, retriggering on a note, or in this case, we could use random. And so random is going to mean that every time I press a note, it's going to start at a different point with the phase. And if we were to slow this right down, you'll really be able to hear that. Especially in polyphonic mode. So that's kind of the max amount of random that you can get out of that poly with the random turned on. We also then have the ability to go in here and add a delay to the LFO. So let's go ahead and put that up to like 2 seconds and you'll hear how this works. You can see it's not going to react, and then it does. So determining on where you put the phase, this could have a big impact. So let's put the phase like up a ways, and then we'll see where it falls this time. So that time it fell right at the top. It's a little too aggressive for me. Have it fall somewhere in the middle. There we go. That's what I was hoping for. Something like that you could set up. So that's just a delay. And then we also have a fade in option so that the depth is going to increase over time. So we'll bring this to 2 seconds and we'll see how the depth starts to get wider. And that's really all there is to that. So if we were on like a quarter note, this would make quite a bit of a bigger difference. But you'll notice that this is something that really only works when you have a note input. So if you were to try to get like a fade or a delay on your LFO on more of an audio source, you would need to go in here, convert this into a hybrid track, go in here, set this to be all ins. And now if I'm playing back and we set it up in a similar way, oh, I just had it turned off. But now if I go and I bring note on, you hear that delay, then it starts going. So this is awesome effect. You can even add some fade in as well. This is probably my favorite part to this. So you could, again, do what I did before that time, and you could use the note receiver, and then you could set up notes to be triggering and re-triggering this over and over again, and you can get some really interesting and cool results taking advantage of all of the different parameters in here. So LFO, I would argue, is going to probably solve almost all of your needs. Bead Lfo does come with the little groove signature on it, and then inside of the Classic Lfo, you're able to easily jump between rhythmic values, which you could do in here, but I think inside of the Classic that's easier. Plus you have that little curve setting that's going to get you some really unique and interesting shapes. So definitely get in there and experiment with modulating these different parameters. That is something that you can absolutely do and probably should do, and just have some fun experimenting. This one is great. You can get all sorts of different shapes. You can change this stuff in real time, and if you're making experimental music, there's really nothing better.